There is a moment where something becomes difficult to ignore, not because it is dramatic, but because it is consistent. You begin to notice that your reactions are different. Your priorities have shifted. The way you think, the way you respond, the way you experience things, it no longer feels exactly the same. At first, this appears in small ways. You lose interest in things that once felt important. Conversations that used to engage you now feel repetitive. Goals that once motivated you no longer carry the same weight, and you cannot always explain why. Nothing obvious has changed, but something within you has. You may try to reconnect with what you used to enjoy, to feel the same way again, to respond with the same level of interest, but it does not fully return. The experience feels different, less compelling, less convincing, and that difference begins to grow. You start noticing it more often, in your daily life, in your interactions, in the way you relate to your own thoughts. You are still present, still functioning, still moving through the same environment. But internally, something has shifted, and the more you become aware of it, the more a question begins to form. Am I still the same person? This question does not arise suddenly. It builds over time, through repeated moments where your response no longer matches your past. You may notice in situations where you expect yourself to react in a certain way, but you don't. A situation that would normally excite you feels neutral. A conversation that would normally affect you feels distant. A decision that once seemed obvious now feels irrelevant. And in those moments, there is a subtle sense of disorientation, because your current experience does not align with your previous identity. The way you used to define yourself no longer fits as clearly. And that creates a kind of internal gap between who you were and who you are becoming. This gap is not always comfortable because identity provides stability. It gives continuity to your experience. It allows you to recognize yourself over time. But when that identity begins to shift, that stability becomes less certain. You may feel like you are in between, not fully connected to your past self, but not yet fully defined in your present one. This in-between state can feel unclear, even unsettling, because it removes familiar reference points. You can no longer rely on the same patterns to define who you are, and at the same time, the new pattern is not fully formed. So you exist in a kind of transition, where things feel different, but not yet stable. You may also notice this in how others perceive you. People who know you may expect certain reactions, certain interests, certain ways of being. And when you don't respond in the same way, it becomes noticeable, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly. You've changed. You're not the same as before. These observations can feel accurate, but also incomplete, because what has changed is not always visible from the outside. It is internal, a shift in how you experience yourself, a reorganization of what feels aligned. And this is difficult to explain, because it is not a single change. It is a gradual movement, one that affects multiple aspects of your life at once. Your thoughts, your emotions, your motivations, all adjusting in ways that are not always clear. You may try to define this new version of yourself, to find a way to describe it, to give it structure, but it resists simple definition, because it is still unfolding, still in process. This is where the experience becomes more complex. You are aware that you are changing, but you cannot fully articulate what you are changing into. And that uncertainty can create tension, a desire to stabilize, to define, to understand. But at the same time, something within you resists going back. Even if the past feels more familiar, more structured, more certain, there's a sense that returning to who you were is no longer possible. Not because you cannot behave the same way, but because you no longer experience it in the same way. And that makes a difference. You can repeat the same actions, but they do not feel the same internally, which means the identity that supported them is no longer fully active. And this realization can feel both liberating and unsettling. Liberating because it opens a possibility for something new. Unsettling because it removes the certainty of what was known. You're no longer fully defined by your past, but you are not yet fully defined by your present. You are in between, and that in-between space is where the real shift is happening. Not externally, but internally, in how you perceive yourself, in how you relate to your own experience. And once this process begins, it tends to continue, not in a straight line, not in a predictable way, but consistently enough that you can no longer ignore it. You are changing, even if you cannot fully explain how, even if you cannot yet define who you are becoming. And that realization marks the beginning of something deeper. What you are experiencing is not a loss of identity. It is a shift in what your identity is built on. For a long time, your sense of self has been organized around the ego. Carl Jung defined the ego as the center of conscious awareness. It is what gives you continuity. It allows you to say, "This is who I am." It organizes your thoughts, your memories, your preferences, your reactions. Without it, there would be no stable sense of identity. But Jung also made something very clear. The ego is not the totality of the psyche. It is only a part of it, a necessary part, but not the center of the whole system. At earlier stages, this distinction is not felt. The ego appears to be the whole. Your thoughts feel like your identity. Your preferences feel fixed. Your reactions feel consistent. And this creates a stable sense of self. But individuation begins to change this. As awareness deepens, you start to recognize that what you once identified with is not as fixed as it seemed. Your thoughts change. Your reactions shift. Your interests evolve. And gradually, the structure that once defined you becomes less stable. Not because it is disappearing, but because you are seeing beyond it. Jung described this as a movement toward the self. Not the ego, but the larger totality of the psyche. The self includes everything, conscious and unconscious, what you know about yourself, and what you have not yet recognized. And as this larger structure begins to emerge in your awareness, the ego loses its central position, not completely, but enough to create a shift. You are no longer fully identified with it. You can observe it. You can see how your thoughts arise, how your reactions form, how your identity has been constructed over time. And this observation changes your relationship to it. What once felt solid now feels flexible. What once felt certain now feels open. And this creates the experience you are having, the sense that you are not the same person anymore, because the identity you were relying on is no longer the only reference point. You are seeing beyond it, and that changes everything. Jung understood that this process often feels like a dissolution, not of the self, but of the previous structure of the self. The ego begins to lose its fixed boundaries. It is no longer able to define you in the same way, and this creates a kind of internal space, a space where identity is no longer rigid, but not yet fully restructured. This is why the experience can feel uncertain. You are not losing yourself, but you are losing the clarity of who you thought you were, and that can feel disorienting, because identity provides orientation. It tells you how to act, what to value, what to pursue. Without that clear structure, everything becomes more open, more fluid, but also less defined. You may notice that decisions feel different, not necessarily harder, but less guided by fixed preferences. You are no longer acting from a clearly defined identity. You are responding more directly to what you experience. And this can feel unstable at first, because it removes the automatic framework you once relied on. Jung emphasized that this stage is not a problem to solve. It is a necessary phase of transformation. The ego must loosen its grip so that a broader sense of self can emerge. But this emergence is not immediate. It unfolds over time. And during that time, there's a gap, a space between identities, where the old one no longer fits, and the new one is not yet fully formed. This is a space you are in, and it is not comfortable because it lacks definition. It does not give you a clear answer to who you are, but it is also where something essential is happening. You are no longer confined to a fixed version of yourself. You are becoming aware of the process itself, the way identity forms, the way it changes, the way it adapts. And this awareness allows for something new, not a fixed identity, but a more flexible relationship to who you are. You begin to see that identity is not something you have to maintain. It is something that evolves, something that reflects your current state of awareness. And as that awareness expands, identity adjusts, not all at once, but gradually. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming a specific version of yourself, but becoming more aligned with the totality of your psyche. And that process requires this phase, where the old structure dissolves, where certainty decreases, where the sense of self becomes less defined, because only through that dissolution can something more complete begin to form. And that is what you are moving through, not a loss of who you are, but a transformation of how you experience yourself. At some point, the need to define yourself begins to soften, not because the question disappears, but because it no longer demands an immediate answer. You stop trying to clearly identify who you are at all times. You stop needing a precise description, a stable label, a fixed version of yourself that remains consistent in every situation. And in its place, something else begins to form. A different way of relating to your own identity. Less rigid, less constructed, more responsive. You may notice this in how you move through your day. Situations arise, and instead of reacting from a predefined role, you respond more directly, not perfectly, not without influence from past patterns, but with less attachment to being a specific version of yourself. You are not trying to maintain an image. You are not adjusting constantly to match a fixed identity. You are simply responding to what is happening, and that response can change from moment to moment, depending on the situation, depending on what you perceive, depending on what feels aligned in that moment. This creates a kind of flexibility, not instability, but openness. You are no longer limited to a narrow definition of who you are. You can express different aspects of yourself without needing them to fit into a single, consistent structure. At first, this can feel uncertain, because identity has always provided a sense of stability, a way to recognize yourself across time. Without it, things can feel less defined, less predictable. But if you stay with it, you begin to notice something important. You are still there, still aware, still present, even without a fixed identity. And that presence becomes a new reference point, not a concept of who you are, but the direct experience of being. You begin to trust that you do not need a rigid structure to exist coherently, that you can move through different situations without needing to hold on to a constant definition. And this trust changes how you experience yourself. You are less concerned with consistency, less focused on maintaining a certain image, more attentive to what is actually happening. This also changes how you relate to change itself. Before, change would feel disruptive, a threat to your sense of identity. Now it becomes more natural, because identity is no longer something fixed that needs to be protected. It is something that evolves, something that reflects your current state. And as that state changes, your identity changes with it. This removes a certain kind of pressure, the pressure to remain the same, to act in ways that are consistent with your past, to maintain a stable narrative about who you are. Instead, you allow that narrative to shift, to update itself as your experience evolves. And this creates a different kind of continuity, not based on sameness, but based on awareness. You are not the same person you were before, but you are aware of the process that connects those versions. And that awareness provides a deeper form of stability, one that does not depend on fixed characteristics, but on the ability to remain present as things change. This also affects how you relate to others. You are less concerned with how they define you, less attached to maintaining a consistent image in their perception, not because you reject connection, but because your sense of self is no longer dependent on external recognition. You can engage, interact, connect, without needing those interactions to confirm who you are. And this creates a quiet independence, not isolation, but internal stability. You are not shaped entirely by how others see you. You are aware of it, but not defined by it. Carl Jung described this as a more integrated relationship with the self. The ego still exists. It still organizes your experience, but it is no longer the sole reference point. It operates within a larger awareness, one that is not limited to a single identity. And this is what you are beginning to live, not as a final state, but as an ongoing process. There will still be moments where you seek definition, moments where you want clarity about who you are. That is natural, but those moments no longer dominate your experience. You can return to a more open state, where identity is not something you hold tightly, but something that moves with you. And this movement is what gives it depth, because it reflects your growth, your awareness, your evolving relationship with yourself. You are no longer trying to become a fixed version of who you are. You are allowing yourself to become. And that is a very different way of living. At some point, the question changes completely. It is no longer, why don't I feel like myself anymore? It becomes, which version of myself am I holding on to? Because what you are experiencing is not the disappearance of identity. It is the end of a structure that no longer fits. For a long time, that structure gave you stability. It allowed you to recognize yourself, to move through life with a sense of continuity, to say, this is who I am. But that version of you was never meant to remain unchanged. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He saw identity not as something fixed, but as something that evolves with awareness. And when awareness expands, the old identity cannot contain it anymore. It begins to loosen, to shift, to dissolve, not as a failure, but as a necessity. Because you cannot grow while remaining confined to a version of yourself that no longer reflects who you are becoming. And that is what this experience is showing you. You did not lose yourself. You outgrew the structure that once defined you. And that process does not feel stable. It does not feel clear, because it removes something familiar before something new is fully formed. You are no longer who you were, but you are not yet fully who you are becoming. And that space in between can feel uncertain, even disorienting. But it is also where the real transformation is happening. Because for the first time, you are not relying on a fixed identity to guide you. You are relating directly to your experience, responding to what is present, allowing yourself to change without needing to define it immediately. This is not a loss of self. It is a shift in how the self is experienced. Less as a fixed point, more as a process. Less as something you hold on to, more as something that unfolds. Before we close, take a moment to reflect on something honestly. Think about who you believed you were 1 year ago. Now compare that to how you experience yourself today. Not externally, internally. What has changed? And more importantly, what are you still holding on to that no longer feels true? That question does not need an immediate answer, but it points to something essential. Because the more you allow yourself to release what no longer fits, the more space you create for what is still forming. If this resonates, write in the comments one way you've noticed yourself changing recently. Not something you planned, something that simply happened. And if you know someone who feels like they are losing themselves without understanding why, share this video with them. Because sometimes what feels like losing yourself is actually the moment you stop being who you were never meant to remain.